Morning, Ross.
Morning, Mark. How are you?
I'm very good. We're getting a little late start here. I tried to bribe my daughter. I said if she cooperated and got to school and got going, I would mention her on Blogging Heads TV. And that was a very effective blog. It was a very effective bribe.
Really? She's easily bribed then.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think she might think Blogging Heads TV is sort of a bigger thing than it actually is.
Well, sure. we won't disabuse her of that notion.
So consider her mentioned. Let's see. I wanted to talk. You have written a number of things recently that kind of got my juices going in a good way. And one of them, which is always a dicey topic, was the item you wrote about a week ago, where you said that you sort of thought that people who were straight up hated religion, the Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett kind of, people who are out to prove the non-existence of God. I think anybody who's religious is just crazy or whatever. That you found that preferable to people who were kind of indifferent among religions and thought there was really nothing that made one religion better than another. And since I'm very much in the latter camp, not particularly religious, but enormously kind of respectful of the broad range of religious traditions, and the sort of Dennett Dawkins stuff kind of drives me crazy because I think they're, for a number of reasons, I feel like okay, that's me. So I want to kind of get you going on that again. And I guess the real question is, if you are not, the way I would put the question to you is, if you're obviously if you're a believer, you believe your religion is better than others. You live in a democracy, you don't impose that in a lot of ways on people. So what's the difference? In other words, what's the practical value what's the practical effect of, in a liberal democracy, believing your religion is actually better than everybody else's?
Well, I guess to start out, I should clarify that what I was responding to originally was a comment by Joe Klein, who was prevailed upon by his many enemies in the blogosphere to come up with actual definitions for the terms left-wing extremist and right-wing extremist, which he throws around. And so on his list of attributes of a right-wing extremist was, the belief that your own religion is better than other religions. And, as a religious person who does in fact think that my own religion is better than other religions, which is why I believe in it, that sort of got my dander up, and so I wrote the blog post that in turn got your dander up.
Not really my dander up, just kind of got me interested.
Right. Well, I guess I'd say I don't really think that the anti-theism of a Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris is preferable to an intellectually serious agnosticism that that is respectful of religion, is not religious itself, but is interested and engaged by the questions that religion raises. I think there has to be a distinction, though, between that kind of agnosticism and what I think Joe Klein was throwing out, which is something that floats around a lot in liberal culture, which is the idea that all religions are equally good or equally bad, and even trying to draw distinctions between them is an inherently illiberal exercise. And what I went on to say in my post was just that the whole idea behind liberalism's relationship to religion is precisely what you just said, the idea that religious people give up trying to impose their particular sectarian beliefs on the entire population. They give up attempting to coerce belief, and in return, there's religious toleration and freedom of religion, and they aren't coerced by anyone else. And the theory of this bargain is that this should clear up lots of space for interesting non-political debate over religious truths. And I think the history of America suggests that this has worked pretty well. America has a thriving religious marketplace. You have polemics flying back and forth on either side. What I find both worrisome and also deeply, deeply irritating is the idea that you get from people like Klein, which is that eventually this sort of indifferentism, religious indifferentism in politics, migrates to the world of ideas, so that the liberal bargain eventually means that not only can I not, impose my Catholicism on you, but it's illiberal for me to, for instance, write a book arguing that Catholicism is superior to Protestantism. And it's at that point that I think, and I don't think that like Joe Klein is actually an intolerant guy. I don't think there's actually a climate of intolerance. I think it's just more a climate of I would like to see the day, and maybe this is a silly idea, but where someone can take to the pages of the New York Times Book Review and you would have a serious Protestant reviewing a book by a serious Catholic and explaining why, as a serious Protestant, he thinks the serious Catholic's interpretation of Christianity is completely wrong and the Protestant interpretation is correct. And I don't think that happens nearly as much as it should. And that's the only thing that I like about the Dawkinses and Harrises, is that they do seem to have the idea that like intellectual combat is an important part of religious discussion.
Right. But and traditionally it has been. But if you're not aggressively proselytizing, why would you argue that? Why is it important to argue between Catholics and Protestants?
Because the
how many? Are you actively interested in converting Protestants?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Counter Reformation.
Well, I haven't had very much success on that front over the years, but I'm always hopeful.
Yeah.
And I think that a certain amount of proselytization is healthy for. If you look at it from the point of view of non-religious ideas, Republicans sort of in loose ways try and convert Democrats to their set of ideas all the time, and Democrats try and convert Republicans, and libertarians try and convert social conservatives, and so on. And the questions that religion raises are obviously different from the questions that political ideology raises, but they're also very important questions. And I think a debate between a Catholic and Protestant, or a Catholic and a Muslim, or a Catholic and agnostic is valuable because these are questions that should be debated. They're questions about the ultimate meaning of existence and how we should live our lives. And also, one of the things that people often say to social conservatives like me is that we're interested in breaking the liberal bargain because we're pro-life, for instance, and so being pro-life is an unfair imposition of my religious beliefs on other people, and I should just work to change the culture in the private sphere. So it's a little bit much to then get told that even in the private sphere it's somehow illiberal to try and convince people that my set of religious beliefs is correct.
Right. Yeah, I don't actually really believe either one. I think one can be. I don't think that the fact that someone's pro-life belief comes from a religious place makes it any less legitimate as a public argument than somebody whose similar belief or different belief comes from a different place. If somebody, Tim Kaine is opposed to the death penalty because out of his Catholic tradition. Somebody else, I'm opposed to the death penalty, and it's not out of a Catholic tradition. It's not like his position is imposing a religious viewpoint and mine isn't. So I don't hold the first viewpoint. I guess I just don't. If all it comes down to is you can argue, then okay, fine. But I guess I thought you were getting at something a little bigger when you really were saying that it was important to believe that you could really act on the belief that your religion is better than others. And I guess I didn't really see what the action was.
Well, the action is the action has to be. Within the framework of the liberal bargain, the action has to be intellectual rather than religious. But I just object. I think this is a debate that's actually come up a lot, thanks to Mitt Romney, with the issue of of Mormonism, which a lot of other religious people, myself included, includes some relatively ludicrous beliefs, and religious outsiders then turn around and say, well, but you as a Catholic believe that a guy rose from the dead and walked on water and turned loaves into fishes and all the rest of it. Who are you to make distinctions between the rationality of your crazy religious beliefs versus Mitt Romney's crazy religious beliefs? Right. And I think that actually it's perfectly reasonable to say that my religious beliefs are ludicrous because they violate certain materialist and naturalistic assumptions about the nature of the universe. But and they definitely do. But there is still an intellectual distinction to be made that isn't just about my superstitions are old and the Mormon superstitions are new. I mean, the Mormons. Not to get too deep into the weeds here, but just to take this one example. Mormons believe not only in an alternate theory about, supernatural events that have taken place in the history of the universe. They believe in an alternate archaeology and alternate timeline of human history, which is, it could be true, but it is, there are distinctions to be made between the belief that a historical figure called Jesus Christ had certain supernatural events associated with him, and the belief that the Native Americans were the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, although either one, if you just cooked it up from scratch, I mean, we're comfortable with Christianity because we're comfortable with Christianity, even if it's a very familiar story. If you just if there was nothing and you just at the time of Joseph Smith cooked up the whole story, it would be equally
we're also
preposterous. I mean, its depth in tradition has something to do with
its depth in tradition, but also its connection to actual historical events. I mean, there was in fact a Roman Empire. There was in fact a province of Palestine. There was, in fact, what most historians think, someone named Jesus of Nazareth, and so on. Whereas there was not, in fact, I forget exactly what the names are, and our Mormon watchers will, probably point out in college, but it's like the Naphtalites and the different, basically fictional historical civilizations that Smith either had revealed to him or fabricated or something in between.
Right. It is, it is worth going through that book some night in a Marriott. Definitely, I need some unusual stuff in there. I guess that's right. Oh, sorry, I was going to say. Oh, I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me, though, is that a lot of people, almost every religious person, there are things that there are things that violate natural law or whatever that they're able to believe and not believe simultaneously. I mean, most religious people don't try to hold to the view that the Earth is 8,000 years old, right?
Right.
I mean, they don't try to strip their religion of that view, and they don't actually try to change their textbooks either.
Well, but
right. I mean, there's a kind of negative capability that goes with.
Well, but that's but I mean that's a case where the reason that that people thought that the Earth was 8,000 years old was in part because it just within my own religious tradition, it's never been a doctrine of the Catholic faith that the Earth was 8,000 years old. There was a limited amount of historical knowledge about the Earth. The Bible suggested that the Earth was 8,000 years old. Therefore, most people thought that the Earth was 8,000 years old. But once the fossil record made it abundantly clear that this was not the case, the Catholic Church, in part having learned its lesson from the Galileo affair, but in part because really this was not a substantial portion of the Catholic faith, didn't go around anathematizing archaeologists and so on. I mean,
right. But the story doesn't work otherwise. I mean, for deeply fundamentalist, for that faction of deeply fundamentalist Protestants, the story doesn't work unless the Earth is 8,000 years old, and the story has to work for
Well,
them.
right,
But for most other people, it doesn't really matter that the story doesn't quite work.
right. But again, that all
Right.
That's a case again where I think it's reasonable to say that Roman Catholicism is superior to that kind of intellectually superior to that kind of fundamentalism precisely because it doesn't insist upon a literal reading of a text that I think manifestly is not intended to be taken literally.
Right.
But anyway, but yeah, I'm afraid I'm.
Whereas I don't care unless you tear out pages of text.
Well, right. I'm afraid I'm not.
You can believe what you want about it.
I'm not taking it, maybe as politically intolerant a position as you were hoping I would.
Yeah, I was looking for that. I was just, I'll tell you what, this topic has always interested me, and the reason is that about 10 years ago, when we were living in Washington, we had neighbors, these neighbors in the basement apartment of the building we were living in, tiny little apartment. This couple was like 85 and 90 years old, very sweet people, and they almost all the time, they wore purple. And I thought, there's something going on here. And you talk to them more, and I found out they were adherents of a religion that had a flowering in the 30s and 40s. That was a kind of like a New Age religion, sort of like Theosophy, that was called I Am, the two words I Am. And there's actually a little temple, a little I Am temple on Calvert Street in Washington. You barely notice the sign, but they wanted to live near there. They come from California. And apparently there was a large I Am temple in Chicago, and it was a big movement at one point. And it was big, the guy who founded it had a whole set of beliefs where he had gone up Mount Shasta and he'd met the Archangel Gabriel who told him these things, and then he met George Washington who told him these other things, and all these various religious traditions are kind of mixed into one. And he was indicted and convicted of tax fraud in the 40s, and the Supreme Court threw out the conviction on the grounds that no jury can actually judge the truth or falsehood of any religion, which is actually one of the great, and in some ways the most uncontroversial of all our, religious freedom decisions. I mean, it's not less controversial than the Lem decision, for example, on school prayer, and. I always found that fascinating. So the other day I was looking at this new history of libertarianism that came out.
Brian Doherty, right?
Called Radicals for Cap, Brian Doherty's book. And I was just flipping through it, and all of a sudden there's a whole thing about how one early wave of libertarians, which were this thing called the Rampart schools. I didn't read the whole chapter, so I sort of read it out of context. This whole chapter actually came out of the I Am religious movement, and that's actually like one of the important threads, I guess, that he traces feeding into the libertarian movement. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
It's fascinating.
This pops up every once in a while, so you've got your twin nemesis there of incorrect religion and libertarianism. Every day
I fall asleep, frustrated by the two of them. But it's interesting. I mean, the segue from from religion to political ideology maybe provides us with a good segue from the topic of religion to the topic of neoliberalism.
Yeah, well, let's do that. But I wanted to say, I mean, one thing you said before about how, religions compete in the same way that Democrats and Republicans compete. It's like, well, partly Democrats and Republicans compete by changing their viewpoints, right? So one theory is that they converge on the median voter. Right? So you could have a kind of converging of religions on the median believer or something.
Well, and that's, one of the major theories of why religion is so successful in the United States compared to Europe is precisely that kind of marketplace convergence. The difference is, I think, that religions tend to converge on something more religiously intense than the median American, precisely because it doesn't do a religion any good to have, its average member be sort of lukewarmly religious.
Right.
Otherwise you get the free rider problem, and you get, eventually your church will fail because it's dependent on highly involved people, and so that's why, the cycle of religions in American history is, you have somebody with a lot of fervor, and then the religion loses its fervor, and then somebody else comes along with more fervor and picks up the people who would abandon the original ship. Right.
Well, that's where I think a lot of liberals. what frustrates me about a lot of liberals is they look at religion and politics as linked in a right-wing way right now, and then they're interested in the nexus of religion and politics, but not very interested in what goes on within religion, and what's gone on within religion, where in fact, especially in the mainline Protestant churches, right, that, all the things you've described have happened. They're lukewarm people, they've sort of lost the value that they have for people, and their members are old and they're disconnected and so forth. And then other religious forces have grown up in their place, which in turn, in addition to their theological role and their community role and their communal role and so forth, they also bring their adherents into a more right-wing political direction than religion traditionally has in this country. But if you're not interested in the religious aspect of it, if you just think it's all a bunch of crazy believers, you don't really get why that happened.
Well, right, and then over time, I mean, what you see happening with evangelicalism, which has basically replaced the main line, is this divide right now between the older generation for whom evangelicalism as political activism has always just been wedded to abortion and now same-sex marriage, and then sort of down the line support of the Republican Party platform, are coming into conflict with the younger generation who are taking up a new, different set of issues, whether it's global warming or poverty or what have you.
Right. Criminal justice too. I mean, it's really remarkable.
Yeah, no, prison reform is. People liberals tend to be shocked and surprised that there is a there is a liberal tradition, and there are things you're going to agree with and things you're going to disagree with, but it's not all. Well, and one of the things historically, evangelicalism in this country has not been a conservative force.
No,
and if you look at the most successful, I mean, part of the reason I think that pro-life activism has been as successful as it has been, and a reason it will long outlast, I think, the debates over gay marriage. I mean, there'll still be a pro-life movement long after the country has basically moved on from gay marriage, is precisely because it taps into the convergence of liberalism and evangelicalism, the ideas of human rights extended to the womb and so on.
Right.
And,
right.
I mean, whether that's obviously liberals would say, well, that's not actually what liberalism should say about this and so on, but it is it's the same people who were crusading for the social gospel, or the same kind of people, religiously speaking, who ended up crusading against abortion in the 1980s. Right.
And you have to understand. I mean, you have to understand the difference between seamless thought, Catholicism, and other. Well, never mind. I won't go too deep into that. But I think a lot of liberals don't, because they don't care where it comes from, I guess. And maybe it does matter where it comes from. Anyway, so back to politics. I want to pull it back to religion for a second. Neoliberal. We have I think one goal here is to talk about David Brooks so much that he has to come on Blogging Heads TV. So, you want to start by talking about neoliberals, or you want to start by talking about why everyone hates David Brooks?
Well, let's start by talking about why everyone hates David Brooks, because
I vowed a long time ago, the easiest thing, if you're a liberal blogger, the easiest thing to do is I can't believe what David Brooks wrote today. I mean, the only thing easier is, I can't believe what Michelle Malkin wrote today,
Well, Michelle Malkin, I understand. Michelle Malkin exists to piss off liberals,
right,
and doesn't attempt to do anything else. David Brooks, I mean, the latest thing and the thing that inspired me to write this sort of ranting and raving blog post was Brooks wrote a column of making fun of alternate parents in
right,
Brooklyn and Manhattan. The people who are making their kids listen to Sufjan Stevens and dressing them up like mini hipsters and so on. And the column was I would not say it was Brooks's best column. I wouldn't say it was his funniest column. I read it and I was like, oh, that's, a harmless piece of sort of, silly, fake crotchetiness. And
Right.
A series of people, starting with Ben Adler on the American Prospects blog, just tore into Brooks and saw this column as just another example of how he uses his pose of being a cultural critic to attack liberals as effete, wimpy, un-American, and so forth.
Right.
And then you said something actually quite interesting, which is that the real problem with David Brooks is that he's sort of in the position of posing as the voice of a younger generation, when in fact he's
under 50.
Right, the under 50 generation. When in fact he's as you would expect from a 40-something columnist, he's totally out of touch. And the annoying thing is that he writes columns where he references Jen Stevens and tries to act hip. But I don't think that that's the standard liberal blogger objection to David Brooks. I think the standard objection is that he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, that he's constantly either using cultural criticism to subtly tear down liberalism, or he's pretending to agree with liberals a little bit only in order to caricature their positions.
Right. Okay. And I've given some thought to this, and I think that it is not necessary it is not essential to be 40-something and be totally out of touch, right? It is not necessary to write like you're 70 when you're 45. And it's not admirable. And that tone of there's nothing, the tone you took of there's nothing has changed in the alternative culture in the last 30 years. It's all exactly the same. Well, you're not a cultural critic if that's your attitude. Well, that's a position. That's a kind of grandpa kind of position. But that's not you're not actually engaging in cultural criticism if you say something like that. As far as I'm concerned, so that's a little frustrating to me. I do think that I do think that what Brooks very often does is by creating categories and then putting too much into those categories, that's where he drives people crazy. So that the whole alternative parenting thing, and I'm guilty of this, as I think I admitted. I said I'd mention my daughter. I'll mention that her favorite music is post-punk.
How old is your daughter?
Well, she's 6. She'll be 6 in a few weeks. It's a term she heard from me. Whatever. And we do take a little too much pride. It's silly. And I lived in Brooklyn. I'm guilty of some of this. But it feeds into Brooks's whole, there are two Americas shtick. And that culture over there is totally different from, the regular American culture. And that is part and parcel of his political argument. Right? It's two Americas. It is always thus. Their cultural differences are as deep as their political differences, are as deep as their religious differences, and there's really no point in trying to bridge those two. That's part of the argument. And then I think by making arguments that seem like they're just category arguments, he puts names on things, and we'll talk about the neoliberal thing in a minute, because more and more I think that's part of the same phenomenon. By putting names on things, it seems like you're making a gentle argument about categories, and in fact you're making a quite aggressive political argument that at the end always does dismiss and put aside any kind of liberalism. But you do it it's not so much that he says nice things about liberalism. You can do that. It's a different kind of thing that he's engaged in, I think. But by misusing categories.
Okay. Well, I guess I would separate out your 2 points, and I would say I think it's a valid critique of Brooks to say that he, both his cultural criticism and his political writing may be over-reliant on categorizations and sort of fun tropes and so on. I think the idea that he is a purveyor of the two Americas theory is. It's understandable because he did write the big, sort of anecdotal Red and Blue America piece for my employer, the Atlantic Monthly, about, right after 9/11 and so on. But I think if you go back and read both that piece and then the bulk of the stuff he's written about, liberalism and conservatism, red America and blue America, and so forth, the point that he actually always comes back to is the idea that no, actually we're one America, and the things that we have in common are much stronger than the things we don't have in common, and so forth. I mean, I think that the key to understanding David Brooks is that he's a centrist, and his political biases, where he is unfair to people, it's usually when he caricatures radicals on either side, whether it's I think that when he writes about people who are opposed to illegal immigration, for instance, on the right, I think he oversimplifies things, and because they're sort of outside the mainstream on one side, and then when he writes about left-wing intellectuals in New York, maybe he oversimplifies on that side because they're outside the mainstream on that side. But if you go back and look at whether it's Bobos in Paradise, whether it's the essays that ended up in On Paradise Drive, Brooks coined the term latte town, for instance, I think. And he wrote a piece.
He coined
the term latte town for towns like Burlington, Vermont.
Oh, yeah.
And he wrote a piece in the Weekly Standard in the late 1990s about latte towns. And I think if you went and asked your typical liberal blogger, well, what did this piece have to say? They'd say, well, this was undoubtedly yet another example of David Brooks talking about how effete and out of touch, latte town America is. But in fact, the piece was nothing of the sort. It was essentially a celebration of the latte town. And what Brooks liked about it, it's true, was that it seemed like, some of the sort of more strident left-wingishness of the people who live in latte towns has been curbed over the years, and they've become more moderate and more centrist and more like David Brooks. But, the same was true of his piece, The Organization Kit, for The Atlantic. The piece was... He went to an Ivy League university, a bastion of liberalism, and half the piece was about how great the kids were there. And then at the end, he got fretful and said, well, the danger is we're losing sight of high ideals and so forth. But I think the idea that Brooks is out to caricature modern liberalism for political ends is itself a caricature of what he's actually written. And I think if there is a critique to be marshaled up, then it's a critique of the problems with centrism, and how for instance, how did American centrists like Brooks all end up supporting the Iraq War? I think there's a perfectly valid critique there. I just don't think that's the critique that tends to show up.
Right. I mean, why does he? I don't understand the importance of him being a centrist. And first of all, I don't think he's a centrist, but I don't understand. I do think it's important to him to pose as a centrist. So that's the shtick. I'm a centrist and I see these things on both sides. But he's not a centrist. I mean, he's a cultural and political conservative. Why not own that?
He's a pro-choice, pro-gay marriage conservative. So he's not a real cultural conservative on the two main cultural conservative issues.
Does one know that from his writing?
He wrote a column in the New York Times in favor of gay marriage. He doesn't write about abortion that much, for the same reason that most columnists don't write about abortion. But he's whatever it is, pro-choice through the first trimester or something, which is the standard moderate position. He's in favor of unrestricted immigration, basically,
which is a conservative position. It's a mainstream Republican position.
It's George W. Bush's position. Yeah, it's a Chamber of Commerce Republican position, but it's also a sort of, I would say that that's as close to a centrist position in American life. I mean, it's the New Republic. The only. Let's put it this way. I'd say there are a lot more foes. There are foes of unrestricted immigration on the left and the right, but there are a lot more of them on the right. And then, apart from the Iraq War, which again was in its beginnings a centrist enterprise, and his sort of, his personal affiliation with the Weekly Standard, with conservatism, with the Republican Party, I don't know. I think Brooks is a paradigmatic centrist, actually. I think again, I have all kinds of problems with centrism in American life, and I have all kinds of problems with what David Brooks believes. But anyway, one of the things he believes is that neoliberalism is finished. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? Because he just wrote a column.
And I was called out on this on the American Prospect site. It was demanded that I comment on this, being a potential neoliberal myself, because I worked for Senator Bradley, who was a neoliberal. But I've had trouble doing this because I'm actually not sure. A lot of people who commented on this seem to think they know exactly what that word means, and I don't really. I mean, there was Charlie Peters of the Washington Monthly in 1978 described a set of politicians as being neoliberals, which was to say that at the time when the neoconservatives the term neoconservative was out there, and as people which at the time primarily meant people who'd moved to the right. They were new in their conservatism. Neoliberals were people who took a whole kind of a fresh approach to liberalism. So the early neoliberals, I mean, I looked this up yesterday, there was a book called The Neoliberals by Randall Rothenberg that came out in 1984. As far as, using Google to find old reviews of that book, they were Bradley, Gary Hart, Paul Tsongas, Bob Reich, and Lester Thoreau at MIT. None of them, which is a distinct group. I mean, those are people who were kind of wrestling at that time with the fact that technology was changing our economy, for example. So they were a lot more ready to deal with that than was a standard sort of labor Democrat like Walter Mondale. Right. And some of them were interested in industrial policy, for example. Instead, I think people think the meaning of the word is just Brooks defined it as being fiscally responsible. Which sort of Bob Rubin as neoliberal. Well, the term didn't have. I mean, the term was never used after. I mean, when I worked for Bill Bradley, if you'd said neoliberal, it was that term was not used. Never. And since then, it sort of has this more European meaning, which is kind of radical free trader. I mean, it's a kind of Thatcherite term.
I mean, in part, it's that a set of economists also started being referred to as the neoliberals, right? So there's sort of a conflation of American political neoliberalism with, University of Chicago School of Economic. I'm out of my depth here, so I'll let you continue. I'm a little out of my depth here, so I'll let you.
Well, I felt way out of my depth about 2 minutes ago when I felt like we were talking about David Brooks. I felt like I was arguing with a James Joyce scholar when, all I'd done was read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and,
That's right, I can write the first critical exegesis.
On page 294 of the third printing of Finnegan's Wake, you got me there. Okay, so now that I have the chance to have you out of your depth. I think it was a weird playing with categories to serve his purpose. And I think, if you interpret that, if you take that column and just say, all he was really saying was, Democrats used to make sense and now they're just a bunch of crazy shouters. That's all he was really saying. And if you just said that, people would react to that and, people would argue either that's true or that's not true. But it wouldn't be much of a point. By acting as if he's creating or working in these meaningful categories, he kind of makes people go crazy about, well, what do these categories really mean? And that's why I think it has something in common with his other work, which is, about categorization in ways that are sort of, that do seem to drive people crazy. But there were some interesting parts about the claim. I mean, one of the interesting things to me, I mean, there was once a distinct Washington Monthly view of the world, right? I mean, and it was, or there was certainly a distinct kind of Washington Monthly argument, and of course that's the Atlantic because has a similar lineage. Because of James Fallows and folks like that. And the Atlantic view, the Washington Monthly view of the world was, challenge orthodoxies at all points. That was the place you would go to make the liberal argument for school choice, school vouchers, for example. And it had a distinct character to it. And there was, for example, a distinct American Prospect view of the world, which was, if 30% of this country were unionized instead of 11%, the world would be a hell of a lot better place. We don't need to worry about deficits. It's a Bob Reich viewpoint, and Bob Reich, of course, was one of the original neoliberals. that's neither here nor there. And it's interesting to me, as somebody who writes for both magazines and now, that the differences between them are not nearly as great as they used to be. There's nothing that I write that I think, I could put that in the monthly, but I'd never put that in the prospect, And that's kind of interesting. I think that's partly because of the times we live in. I mean, subtle distinctions among different ways that you might pursue the liberal political project are not that important when you're faced with, the Iraq War, a budget situation that doesn't really allow you to do much of anything. And in a way, it's a sign not so much that the lunatics have taken over the asylum, which is kind of Brooks's point, but that there is a convergence around. There's what you would hope for, which is a lot more conversation and a lot more kind of understanding, a lot more convergence around the idea that there is a overall liberal cause, and it's got to be part of the fight, and not just fighting among themselves. I'll pause there.
Well, but wouldn't you? I mean, not to continue in my role as David Brooks' #1 defendant, but wouldn't you say that it isn't just a convergence? It's that and partially in response to the excesses of the Bush administration, partially in response, and I think Brooks had a line in this piece saying that the new liberals are more have been pushed to the left by the Iraq War on foreign policy and by wage stagnation on economic policy. I mean, don't you think that is at least somewhat true? That I mean, when I look at and Brooks used the New Republic in his column, which may or may not be a good example of this, but I think it's pretty clear that the New Republic is moving leftward on both foreign policy and sort of the broad nest of economic issues, responding to external factors. But I think there definitely is a more invigorated left on the Democratic side of the aisle, and I think a lot of this just has to do with what you just said, the fact that it makes sense to be looking for common ground with conservatives when either liberalism is in power or when you have divided government, as you did in the 1990s. It makes a lot less sense when conservatism is ascendant and, from a liberal point of view, wrecking everything in sight. But I do think there is a real sort of leftward trajectory in liberal thought and democratic politics that wasn't really there in the late 1990s to the same extent.
But how much of that is substance in that, and how much of that is tone? I mean, one of the interesting phenomena is that all of our tones have changed. I mean, my tone is not what it was. My sort of approach to politics and my tone is not what it was in the mid to late 90s. And I would have seemed much more of a centrist in the mid to late 90s, let's say, than I do now. But my positions haven't really changed very much. There's nothing there are a few things, but for the most part, I'm not more left in any real sense of the word. I'm just more consistently shocked by and opposed to Republican politics.
Right. But don't you think, I think that's absolutely true, and that may account for 70% of what I'm describing, or what Brooks was caricaturing, or what have you. But there is, I mean, if you take foreign policy, for instance, I think that the Iraq War has discredited what was the right-wing end of the liberal spectrum on foreign policy. The idea that military interventionism to further the liberal goal of democratization is generally a good idea, or should be a weapon of first resort. I think that idea has been discredited, and that has, invigorated, on an ideological basis, the left-hand side of the Democratic Party. I think that the idea that, John Chait did this piece a couple months ago about Robert Rubin and other economists rethinking their position on wage stagnation, basically, and what it means for the economy. I think they are, again, responding to external circumstances, the failure of the current economic boom to do what the late 1990s boom seemed to do in terms of raising
Right.
wages. That has, again,
Liberalism is an empirical philosophy. Something doesn't work, you admit it.
yeah, no, I'm here. I'm wondering if we want to get into that whole nest, but
Why not? We got about 15 minutes left.
well, but okay, so I'll just concede that point and say, let's say liberalism is an empirical philosophy. Something doesn't work, you admit it. Okay, the things that haven't worked have been associated with the right-hand side of the liberal spectrum, and the things that people want to try now are more associated with the left-hand side of the liberal spectrum. Don't you think that's true? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's
in certain circumstances. For example, I do think there's a little more convergence on trade, for example, and I mean it is true. I mean the position that education alone takes care of the economy, which was a kind of Reuben Clinton position early, in sort of some point in the administration, it doesn't hold water anymore, and so you move to something that actually requires a more active government role. Yeah.
I mean, but when I think of, I think part of the complexity of the whole what is neoliberalism question is, you had the traditional neoliberals who were the Bill Bradleys, the Paul Tsongases, and so forth, and then you had something called New Democrats,
Right.
excuse me, who get conflated with the neoliberals and maybe should be and maybe shouldn't, but there is a distinction between, the neoliberalism of the late 70s and early 80s and the sort of DLC New Democrat liberalism of Bill Clinton, and there are commonalities, but there are also differences. And then you have sort of the debates of this era where you have sort of, particularly with regard to the Iraq War, you have a kind of, militaristic interventionist liberalism that's associated with the Republic. And I think the primary weakness of Brooks's column was that, and again, in his defense, continuing my defense of it, these are tough distinctions to parse in 750 words, but, there are a lot of different threads that go into the ball of yarn that you could call, centrist liberalism since 1975. And different ones. I mean, when I think of neoliberalism, I think of it particularly in terms of the debates over, crime and welfare in the 1980s and 1990s. I mean, that's the place where I think neoliberalism did its greatest service, because I think that's the place where traditional liberalism just completely fell down on the job in the 1970s and 80s. But that's a case where, the debate's kind of over because, the neoliberals, whoever they were, kind of won. But
Well, I mean, crime kind of, for various reasons, got taken off the table in some ways, partly because crime rates went down, partly because the big symbolic gestures of the crime bill and welfare specifically, and that tended to come more from New Democrats, who were in fact the conservative. I mean, New Democrats were kind of the wing that said we've got to keep this southern. There's a southern conservative element of the Democratic Party that has to be kept alive because there's no way to do anything without it. And that was where the energy on welfare reform came from, for example. And a lot of neoliberals like Bradley were vehemently opposed to that. But Clintonism absorbed some of that. And now, as the southern element, I mean, sort of everything comes down to this: the fact that the southern conservative element of the Democratic coalition is, much less significant than it was, and that drives some of this as well. I mean, there's the traditional DLC argument which was without Southern white men we will never be a majority party, doesn't hold water anymore, because you're without Southern white men and you're getting there. So you're building it in other ways around, socially liberal Northeasterners and so forth. So it's a whole different Democratic coalition, and as a result, I mean, that pulls it a little bit to the left, and it also moves the Republican coalition much further to the right.
I mean, I'm particularly interested in this, and maybe at some point I'll write a post about it. But from the point of view of a sort of wannabe reformist conservative like myself, I think there are a lot of interesting lessons to be drawn from the attempts at a reformist liberalism over the last 20 to 25 years. I mean, I think one of the lessons, and this is something where I think, whatever neoliberalism is, it's more left-wing critics, the people who say, oh, neoliberalism is done because it failed. Well, they do have a point insofar as, the last 25 years, the years of sort of neoliberalism, New Democrats, what have you, have not been good years for the Democratic Party in terms of electoral politics. And so, there is sort of there's an interesting question there about it's obviously good for the country that people emerge to critique liberalism from within, and I think it's good for the Republican Party, and it has to happen at some point, and hopefully will happen soon, that more and more people can emerge to critique conservatism from within. I think in terms of selling that to Republicans, who have always been much more of sort of a movement party and a lockstep party, and we're all ideologically on the same side and don't speak ill of a fellow Republican and so on, it's kind of a hard sell in a way, because you can't say, hey, look how great, neoliberalism and then the New Democrats and all those people were for the Democrats in the 80s and 90s. We should have something like that on the right.
Right.
But that's just sort of a tactical thing.
Right. Well, it's very much in, I mean, democratic and liberal fights are very much take place in public.
Right.
I mean, I know there's a lot, I've always believed, when liberals say to me, the strength of the conservatives is they march in lockstep, they get their messages from, somewhere, and Grover Norquist this and that. I just think that's a really dangerous misreading of the right, because there is a lot of what conservatives do, in fact, is argue with each other. But it often takes place in in a sort of closed circle.
Yeah, I think what the Republicans have been good at is not having their politicians knifing each other in the back. They're, the libertarians are knifing the traditionalists, and the supply-siders are knifing the big government conservatives, and all the rest of it all over the place in think tanks and magazines. But when you get politicians up there, they all basically say the same thing. Low taxes, small government, strong on defense, traditional values. The problem for the Republicans is that particular grouping is, I think, running out of steam without some kind of reinvention. And at some point, you're going to have some political knife fights that actually have substance and aren't just a matter of, Mitt Romney trying to subtly imply that Rudy Giuliani, was a bad parent. But so speaking of the Republicans, just quickly, I just wanted to bring up Chuck Hagel because Chuck Hagel's been much in the news lately. He sort of hinted that he was going to make an announcement that he was going to run for president, and then didn't make an announcement. He's been going around criticizing the Bush administration all over the place on foreign policy, and he's become the new Republican that the liberal reporters love now that John McCain is no longer there to fill that role. And I think the reason I'm particularly interested in Hagel is just because I stopped by the newsstand and I picked up Esquire and GQ, and I realized that both of them had profiles of Chuck Hagel. One was a Q&A, but the other one was a profile. And so here's the thing with Chuck Hagel. As a conservative who thinks that Bush foreign policy has basically been a disaster, and that there really needs to be soul searching on the right about what direction conservative foreign policy should go, I'm conditioned to like Chuck Hagel, and I think that he, in theory, represents a tradition that should be better represented in Republican politics, namely the sort of Midwestern foreign policy pragmatism. But Hagel won't actually say anything substantive. I mean, the most substantive thing he's done is critique the surge. But, this is a guy who sort of hemmed and hawed and acted like Hamlet, but in the end voted to authorize the use of force in Iraq, still hasn't said that was a mistake, still won't say the Iraq war is a mistake, won't marshal the actual full-throated critique from the right of the Bush foreign policy that needs to be marshaled, and instead just sort of pussyfoots around with these, if you wanna not make the tough decisions, then you should go sell shoes or whatever he said on that panel. And I just think it's sort of senatorial grandstanding at its worst, and it irritates the heck out of me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have this deep dislike of Senator McCain. I didn't used to, but I've developed it. But I've been sort of interested in Hagel, fine with Hegel. I said to my wife the other day, who's been a congressional correspondent, spent a lot of time up the hill. Like, what actually is there to not? What's the case against Hegel? And she's like, he's sort of, the case against him is easy. He sort of gets to the right place, kind of, but it takes him so long to get there, and he does it with so much egotism. And that's exactly the argument that you're making, and I think that's exactly right. So, and nothing is more emblematic of that than holding an announcement to
not announce. Well, and Chuck Hagel isn't going to be the Republican nominee for president. The Republican base still supports the Iraq War. That said, there is a large chunk of the Republican base now that opposes the Iraq War, and two, clearly there's intellectual room for a conservative critique of the Iraq War that isn't being made by any of the top contenders, all of whom are basically trying to fix their conservative heresies by sort of hugging Bush on the war. So the Republican primary debate desperately needs somebody who can make this critique and make it articulately and be an appealing figure. And in theory, Hagel could be that, but he just seems to not. He seems to be much less interested in that and much more interested in just hugging the spotlight, which was always the thing that I disliked about McCain. I mean, just get this sort of cycle of love from the media, and that's not really. That's not really what you want from your reformist conservatives. Right, absolutely. And he also he's not particularly interested in any other areas of policy. I mean, you could imagine a sort of Walter Jones type, somebody who's has all the right credentials as a social and economic conservative, but is a full-throated critic of the war. Actually picking up that conservative mantle with the critique of the war from the right. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and you'd get, you might get 15% of the vote in the primaries, and you wouldn't get the nomination, but you would make a difference in the debates on the right. So. Right. Well, I don't understand how it is. To me, the Republican nominee, I write this all the time, so you've probably seen me say this. To me, it's a matter of simple math. You've got three candidates who have, in one way or another, problems with the right. McCain, Romney, Giuliani. Their problems are totally different with the right. None of them are going to solve them very easily, and none of them are going to go away as candidates. How is it it seems inevitable that those three, or at least two of them, basically split the vote of the non-right-wing Republican primary voters. And non-right-wing voters in Republican primaries are probably not even a majority of the Republican primary voters. They're probably like 30%. They split that vote. Anyone has to come in and consolidate the actual conservative actual right-wing vote. That person has to be the winner. How is that? I mean, to me, that's just, it's math. Not even. It is. I mean, there are two reasons why that might not, and actually I think probably won't happen. One is the impact of star power in the presidential primary nominating process at this point. And I think there's an extent to which, in order to rally the base, right, you would need to get media traction. You would need to get a lot of attention. You would need to sort of rise in the media's estimation. And the Republican figures who are sort of trying to cast themselves as rally the base kind of people are just not, they don't have the star power of a Giuliani or a McCain. Right. or like
never
the
heard
Jim
of them,
Gilmores, the Fred Thompsons. I mean, yeah, Fred Thompson was a movie star, but these are not people who are going to get the media really excited, and that's what you need. The other thing is this weird phenomenon of, that I think you saw in the Democratic process, primary process in 2004, the sort of weird hyper-pragmatism that voters display. And, maybe this won't be as true for Republicans in 2008 as Democrats in 2004, because Republicans won't be as desperate for a win. But, there's this sort of, in a way that I don't think was really true 15 or 20 years ago, I think more and more primary voters really factor in things like electability to a greater extent than they should. And that's how the Democrats ended up nominating Kerry, and that's why I suspect the Republicans will end up nominating McCain or Giuliani. Now, that said, there is, the one figure who does have star power, would get a lot of media attention, and does have the conservative bona fides, and that's Newt Gingrich.
And he's the savior of civilization. Ladies and gentlemen, Newt Gingrich. And,
I wrote a piece about him for The Atlantic a year ago where I said, he's a fascinating guy who, has way too much baggage and can't win, and I still think that's true, but, he does, and he's not going to, his plan is to get into the race late. He's not going to be able to raise as much money. He's basically just going to be sort of relying on being a fresh face and getting media attention, and, it probably can't happen, but I think it's a lot likelier than it was a year ago. My friend Matt Continetti has a long piece in the Weekly Standard this week about the Gingrich plan, and he says the same thing. He says, well, okay, it's 90% not going to happen, but you can see a path for Newt Gingrich.
Right. Well, he's certainly figuring out how to get in. It's not like he's undecided about getting in.
Right. No, it seems like he's definitely.
And it's hard to imagine that he doesn't. It's hard to imagine that he doesn't get in. So, having gotten in, then what happens? I mean, I don't think he's. I mean, I would assume he could raise the money. He built a pretty big fundraising base.
Yeah, but I mean, I think I think he could raise some money. I just think the size of the war chest that he's going to be able to amass in 3 months is going to be dwarfed by the size of the war chest the other guys have. And you have the problem of you need to line up donors. You need to get donors on your side. If you get into the race late, you're not going to have as many donors. And donors also definitely chase the sort of electability thing. And the one thing Newt Gingrich screams is unelectability.
Right. That's why I love him. that is, I suppose that is true, but I mean the whole sort of new Newt. He's the new Newt, like the new Nixon, and he's serious about health care, and he's got, I don't know.
Right. I mean,
I don't know. People can take very different views of him at different moments.
Well, and he can out-talk anybody, and he's right with the base. He's overweight, which voters don't seem to like based on the track record of the last 50 years or so.
Right. Dick Cheney could only reach the pinnacle of power
hiding behind a
fit man.
Viking, but he's a great talker. He's not, he doesn't come across like Churchill exactly much as he'd like to. He comes across more as a university academic. But yeah, I want to see him on that debating platform.
All right. Yeah. No, I'm excited about it. It's one thing that will make this whole thing interesting. Well, I guess we've both been predicting that for a while.
Well, I guess.
All right, Ross.
Mark, it's been a pleasure, and since we both ended by supporting Newt Gingrich for president, I guess this is.
You could be Secretary of HHS, and I'll take. I'll just get him to put me on the screen.
That sounds good.
Very good.
All right. Great talking to you.
Be well.
See ya.
Bye-bye.